So thanks very much for joining today's session called Unlocking Value, Navigating Open Source Contribution in Finance. This is definitely a beginner to middle level conversation, so there'll be stuff that many of you will be familiar with, and that's fine. There'll also be stuff that's a little bit more further down the chain, but we'll try and make sure we're covering all bases. Before we do that, we'll introduce ourselves. So Kateryna, over to yourself to say hello.
So, hi everyone, nice to see you. My name is Kateryna Nasardinova. I'm a product owner and business analyst in EPAM Systems, where I was recently responsible for driving development of open source solution in EPAM as a part of our former open source program office. And I'm here, happy to speak here today.
Amazing. My name is Chris Howard. I'm also the former head of the Open Source Program Office at EPAM. So a bit of a flag wave if anyone is looking for a new Open Source Program Office lead, then come and find me today. I'm ready and available, although I'm off to Spain at the weekend for a few days first. But hopefully we'll today be sharing lessons learned really on what we've both built within EPAM in terms of open source, but also supporting a number of our financial services and regulatory clients. So we are really speaking from a position of experience here, and hopefully that will be valuable for you in terms of today's session. So what's so special about contributing? We're not talking about consumption of open source here. We've heard that all morning. We know 99% of organizations are consuming open source anyway via various Linux Foundation surveys, etc. We're talking about contribution because it's an area still that many of the financial services and regulated industries are still so nervous to either stick their toe into or even really push beyond the boundaries of that. We know that contributing to open source can be rewarding for individuals to kind of learn, to teach, to better their experience. But today, again, we're talking about this from an enterprise organization lens. So we're not necessarily going to be calling out in too much detail the value to the individuals, although we'll call out some synergies. Instead, we're talking very much about how organizations can benefit and deliver value from open source contribution. So I said we weren't going to talk about individuals, but we are for at least one slide. So the value of open source contribution for individuals you can see on the screen, and I'll touch on a few of these. I think a real key one here is around skills development, that ability to really get hands-on, peer-assessed code, enhance and build your capabilities and competencies in a new language and new technology. You can see at the bottom there that accessing new technologies. There are lots of use cases, and we'll hear some more later on around this ability to get stuck into things that aren't necessarily within your 9 to 5, your kind of day-to-day. And open source provides a really nice forum for you to be able to do that. Similarly, building your portfolio, getting exciting experience, working with global organizations, mentors on projects really outside of your kind of boundaries of what you're working on a day-to-day basis. And of course, giving back to the community. We wouldn't be here doing this talk, nor would many of us be sat here today if we didn't also all want to get behind that collaborative kind of community-based open source piece. But what does that mean in terms of the enterprise? So the value of contribution to an enterprise or an organization. Well, here we're going to get a bit more into the detail. So one, there's this idea around the quality of engineering, the ability to build better products through better code driven off the back of better skilled workforce. The idea of this innovation multiplier, something I borrowed from a presentation I heard last year, that actually we know that collaboration drives innovation and open source is all about collaboration. So this ability to take forward a much stronger idea of innovation than perhaps what you might be seeing coming out of your innovation office or your innovation leads, for example. A massive piece around retaining and attracting talent, and this is something that's often overlooked when we think about open source from an engineering and kind of hands-on code perspective, but really about getting the very best people through the door that are passionate about open source and can demonstrate some of the skills and competencies that we saw on the previous slide in their day-to-day. New technologies, I won't drill into too much, and interoperability. I think we all know the benefits of open source, or certainly what we were talking about in the 80s and 90s around reduced costs, faster time to market, etc. And finally, one I'm really, really passionate about, and if you'd seen me speak at conferences before, I was really labouring this point last year, this idea for open source to start to contribute, as we just heard in one of the keynotes, to some of those bigger organizational goals around CSR, around ESG, around real financial kind of achievements in that space. So if we take that step further and look therefore between the synergies between the individual value of open source contribution and enterprise value, we start to see that by enabling contribution at the individual level, we can then start to leverage some of those enterprise values. And there's some examples on the screen there, that idea about enabling open source contribution, improving individual skills, then by process of growth, build you a better workforce, a more skilled workforce, outputting better products. Similarly at the bottom, by enabling kind of this ability to encourage open source contribution, perhaps maintaining a project as an individual, you then start to establish yourself, oh, well, this is Chris who works for X company and he's maintaining this, so clearly that company must also be championing and advocating for open source. You start to really establish your industry reputation. Similarly, by engaging with organizations like FINOS and other open source foundations, you also then get the business value, the marketing value we heard alluded to a little bit this morning, but also that ability to kind of flag wave and show we are also in this conversation, and that's a really, really important piece. So I mentioned this as a bit of a beginner conversation as well. I think it's important to set the scene as to what contribution might look like, because I think we all assume that it might just be code. So Kateryna is going to take over now and tell us a little bit around contribution, and then we're going to move into the meat of this, which is our kind of roadmap.
So let's talk about what contribution can be from the individual perspective. There can be an assumption that only code can be contributed, and really for the developers there are a lot of opportunities out there. They can fix issues, they can propose new features, they can even automate the project setup and do testing. However, it is a common misconception that only code can be contributed and other areas of the project are usually very neglected because of it. So if there are some individuals in the organization who likes organizing, for example, they can maintain projects, by linking duplicate issues, they can suggest new issues labels, or they can close outdated ones. Also, there can be the others who likes working with people. That's great. They can address the queries on such platforms as Stack Overflow or Reddit, or they can moderate discussions. Also, there might be the others who likes teaching and educating, and for that they can write user tutorials or even mentor others how to code. However, contribution, it's not only some individual actions or like contributing the lines of code. The organizations also should and must contribute, and they can contribute physically by giving entire solutions to open source community. And as you can see on the slide, this is FINOS landscape. This is a snapshot of all solutions FINOS members have contributed to the foundation. And we in EPAM have two solutions shared with FINOS. The one is time-based, which we are really proud to have been shared. So having said that, if you see that there are some tools, models, solutions that are super useful, and you see they will bring a real value to the community, feel free to contribute them to the open source, and you will see the value to your organization.
Amazing. So hopefully, I mean, that's the end goal, really, to be able to contribute an entire solution or a framework or a data model, whatever it happens to be, as an enterprise. But how do we do that? Well, that's where we come into kind of the crux of this conversation today. So this is our roadmap to open source contribution. And this is not a framework. This is not some consultancy. This is just our lessons learned, our ideas, what we've done both within our own organization, but also helping our clients. And we've made it very, very simple and basic. There's no complexity here. And we're going to go into each of these in a bit more detail. So the first is our assess stage. And really, there's two parts to this. But here we're trying to understand the current landscape, both the individual and the open source engagement. The measure stage, which is the real meat of what we're going to talk about today, is once you've got an understanding of what the landscape looks like, how do you then start to analyze that, visualize that, and start to tell some stories and also satisfy some use cases, particularly through that FS and regulatory lens around governance, policy, etc. And then the third is develop. Okay, we've done some contribution. How do we now start to make that incredible? So what initiatives, what kind of resources, what kind of next steps forward can we be doing as an organization to really build a contributing culture and a responsible, safe contributing culture? So let's jump into stage one, which is assess, which I'm going to quickly cover, and then Kateryna's going to go into the real detail around measure. So at the assess stage, there's two key things here. It's super, super simple. The first is who is contributing already. And it's crazy to think that there's so many organizations out there that have got open source contributors, but they have no idea. So there's two easy approaches that we've taken here and have worked really, really well. The first is just to use your existing infrastructure. So if you're using a tool like Workday or SAP, or even an informal process like sending out a quick Microsoft form or whatever to say, are you on GitHub? What's your username? Or this is one of the custom fields we have in our HR platform. Let's collect that data. they're your employees. As long as they're happy to divulge that information, you've got access to their GitHub profile. Then what you can then start to do is leverage something like the GitHub API and start to pull through all of their commits, their push events, etc. Where are they contributing to? And we're going to see a bit more of that visualization on the measure stage. But secondly, let's do a quick look at the organization. So what are we consuming? So use something like the OSS Review Toolkit, which is part of the Linux Foundation. It's a software dependency scanning tool that also creates SBOMs. EPAM's a maintainer, which is why I'm championing it a little bit. But use that to say, let's go down 3 levels of all of our code base and look at what open source dependencies we have. So once you've completed that assess stage, you've now got 2 things. In this hand, you've got all of your contributors, or people who are at least engaged, or open source engaged engineers, as I like to call them. On this side, you've got all of the open source dependencies you have in your organization. Now you can start to think, okay, what do we do with this? How do we start to bring this together? And that's where Kateryna is going to take over and tell us a little bit around some of the stuff that we built within EPAM to start to visualize, aggregate, collate, and measure this information. So we're going to be talking about where are we contributing and what's being contributed. So over to you, Kateryna.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. So first of all, let me introduce into some metrics of what can be measured to prove the value of open source in your organization. And at the first stage, we can start from like high-level view and collect such metrics as total contributions in the company lifetime. And here in EPAM, we actually have really good example of hitting more than 500,000 contributions lifetime this year, which is amazing result. Also, we can assess the size of our community by counting how many individuals contribute in our company and to how many repositories they do that. Having collected that information, we can go even more on deeper level and to take a look on some open source project and assess the project and contribution health there. For that, we can take a simple metric of project cadence, so we can check the activity of the contributions on one particular project over a period of time. And this metric can help us to qualify shift from proprietary to open source approach, and also, most importantly, it can help us to check if our open source engagement strategies are working. So, for example, we might want to engage more employees into open source contribution, and we decide to provide a benefit that they can contribute for some dedicated time, for example, like 2 hours during Fridays to the open source during their working hours. And looking at this graph, we then can see if there are spikes during these dedicated hours or not, so we can check if our strategy is working. Then, if you want to go even more detail, we can look into individual. So we can collect here the names of the individuals who contribute, how many contributions they made, to what repositories they do contributions, and in what languages they do that, and what is the percentage of these contributions there. This can help us to solve various use cases. So, for example, we can map individuals who has open source as a primary activity linked to their role, to them who are using it as a side activity, which we're more interested about. And for example, here we have Valentin, and most of his contribution goes to the one repository. However, we can see the slight activity to the other repositories as well. So it might indicate that Valentin is working on an open source project, but he also contributes in his spare time to other repositories, which is really a good trend. Also, we might notice some negative scenarios here. So we might find the contributions that conflict our business interest. So, for example, there might be contributions with no approvals from the organization, which might contradict our open source policy. Or we can even notice some contributions to the sanctioned organizations, like the ones with strong copyleft licenses. Also, if you look into the languages of what our individuals, of what our employees contribute to, it can help us to reflect on the workforce of our organization. So, for example, we know that we have only Python developers, and then we can see that our metrics are showing that there is JavaScript contribution and it's very popular. So we can analyze why it is going that way. And it can actually lead us to the positive example, and it can demonstrate new capabilities of the organization. Like in EPAM, we celebrated engagement, like increased engagement in Rust language due to its sustainability credentials. And the last metric I would like to present you is tracking attrition and retention rates. So for this one, we can collect how many one-time contributors we have over active contributors, and how many of the individuals are joining our community, and how many of them are leaving it. And this is a very important metric because, as Chris mentioned, building a skilled workforce is a great value to the organization, but it is even more difficult to maintain and keep it. So this metric is helping us to see that. Also, it is a key measure to measure our return on investment on such campaigns as rewards and recognition we might have in an organization that Chris will talk in more detail shortly.
Excellent. And that's actually... I think we've missed.
Sorry.
And that's all right. And that's actually one of my favourite graphs, that attrition one, because it's the biggest question I used to get asked is around, okay, we're spending all of this money on open source initiatives and the things I'm going to talk about in a second, but actually is it making a difference? And to be able to say, okay, we've got 45,000 developers, of which 7,000 are contributing, and we know that over the last 3 months we've maintained or retained open source engaged engineers, at least tells some part of the story. Of course, if we're spending all of that money and then we start to see that figure drop, then perhaps something's not quite going right, or maybe our API is perhaps not working correctly, but that's a conversation for another day. So the third stage of our roadmap really is that develop piece. So let's think about that graph we just spoke about and all of those other visualizations. How do we maintain that, but also how do we perhaps kick off some new initiatives? And there's three big key areas really that we, from an OSPO perspective, and certainly quick wins for some of the clients we put recommendations forward to. The first is around rewards and recognition. So that could be very, very simple. That could just be leveraging some of that data and pinging out an email once a quarter to say, thanks so much for being involved in open source. People sometimes don't even realize you're tracking it, and having that little nudge to say, well done, amazing, then great, they carry on. Similarly, if you've got kind of some kind of badges within your organization, digital badges, perhaps you even do some kind of congratulation newsletters for competency centers. Those are just a great, simple initiative that resource managers, line managers can get stuck into. Secondly, something that was very successful within EPAM, integrating this into the annual review process. So 5 years ago, we were talking about the importance of diversity and inclusion being mapped into annual reviews. Why can't open source now follow that similar trend? So actually, have you ticked these boxes? Have you contributed? Are you doing any maintaining activities, etc.? And does that then tie into things like bonuses, perhaps if you award those? And that brings me to my final point. In EPAM, there's $50,000 that we pay out in financial bonuses to open source contributors, and that's mapped by push events. So if you have over 1,000 push events through commenting on triaging issues, through doing commits, whatever it happens to be, and if they're into specific projects that we feel are business important, we perhaps apply a multiplier as well. We encourage that open source contribution, because the long tail advantage of that is not only do we establish our own reputation in the open source space, but we're able to then start to steer and guide that feature development of open source solutions, which is super important for our clients. The second is around learning and talent. This can be very, very simple through building some learning materials. One of the big gaps that we see is often as part of that onboarding process, we're not calling out what open source means for your organization. So yes, you can contribute to open source. Yes, you can perhaps with some of these caveats. No, you can't. Or yes, you can, and you can use all of our time and resources, which is what it is at EPAM as well. So as long as you're not conflicting against deadlines, go wild, contribute. And that's perhaps why we have some quite impressive numbers that you were alluding to at the beginning. Similarly, another big win there, this talent cheat sheet. So many times our talent acquisition team are coming to us, our recruiters, and saying, we've got this incredible, engineer who wants to know what's going on in the open source space, but we don't really know what to do. So a few bullet points that say, yes, we enable open source contribution. Yes, you can check our GitHub here. And let's actually check your GitHub. So often engineers don't expect the recruiter to be perhaps in the technical space, certainly that first conversation to say, oh, have you got a GitHub profile? Let's check it out. So a few kind of quick lines to take for our TA team was very, very useful. And then finally, that bottom one, this is something that's often regarded as controversial, but I think if you're on the supply side and you're trying to help your clients, you're trying to really win that business, this idea of recruiting for influence. So if you've embedded yourself or your organization into a community, you then start to know who the real game changers are, the maintainers in that space. And then there's nothing wrong after a bit, 6 to 12 months of befriending them and actually making a nice conversation to say, we've got an exciting opportunity for you to come and work on this project. Are you interested? So by being part of that conversation, you can then start to really enhance your kind of long tail in terms of that conversation. And finally, alluding the conference that we're at today, wider engagement. I think engaging with industry is probably the easiest thing in that sense. Yes, it costs a little bit of money sometimes, but coming to conferences, getting your logo out there, getting into some of those working groups, those special interest groups are super, super important. That's how you get people interested, hearing about your organization. Similarly, hosting internal hackathons, but also perhaps inviting guests from other organizations. Kateryna mentioned Rust. We had one of the technical leads from Rust join one of our internal webinars, and that had such a great pull factor because it's not just another VP or another distinguished engineer from the organization chatting. It's someone new from outside the organization, that open source community, coming in and showing that actually we're receptive to that. And finally, sponsor projects. Microsoft, I think you probably saw on Twitter a few weeks ago, Microsoft just did all of these incredible sponsors for all of their open source dependencies. They gave some actual money via GitHub. That's fantastic. Not only does it show that we appreciate your open source solutions and we're contributing to you to enable that ongoing maintenance, but of course there's some value in showing that you as an organization are committed to that. So in our final slide, where do you go from here? Well, the simplest thing, and I've really tried to boil this down, because there's lots we could talk about, but there are kind of three things really that on day one, starting your open source contribution journey, or perhaps being a little bit further down that road in terms of what you do. The first one, it sounds a bit boring, but policy and guidelines on contribution. That could be a 50-page policy around open source. It could be. In EPAM, it's a 2-paragraph charter of understanding. It says you can do X, Y, Z, and at least you can just get the ball rolling and start to contribute. Then, when the time comes, get the chief compliance officer in, get legal in, and start to build something a bit more kind of meaty around that. But that's super important. Secondly, internal knowledge base. New engineers, people getting stuck into open source, they don't want to have to email compliance at or check out some complicated document. They just want a very simple resource on an internal KB that they can go and find. Can I contribute to open source? Yes. What do I need to know? What do I need to install, if anything? Thirdly, flag wave for the FINOS project Git proxy. There's a great session actually this afternoon on that, I think at about 1 o'clock. So Git proxy if it's needed. So if you need those extra gateways between contribution at EPAM, just push what you like and we'll deal with it later if it causes a problem. I appreciate in this industry there's a few more challenges. Something like Git proxy is a great middle ground, so that's there. And finally, and this is not really where to start, but it's something that I think people miss so often, it's just those contributing markdown files on open source projects are so important. They tell everything about getting involved in that project. And so many people, or you see it so many times, raise issues, raise pull requests, and they just immediately get pushed back because they haven't followed a template, they're not necessarily in the community, they don't know what's going on. If we can stress and embed into all of our open source contributors that first reading that file and then getting stuck in is the most important, then I think that creates a fantastic foundation. So, we've done a roadmap, we've done an assess stage where we've found out who's contributing, where they're contributing. We've done a measurement stage, which is the most exciting part for me, where we've visualized, aggregated, and tried to look at that return on investment of open source. And then we've done our development stage, so how do we then extenuate and build that over the next 6 to 12 months. And I've been Chris, you've been Kateryna, and that's the end of our talk. So I believe we have 5 minutes for questions. Yeah, go ahead.
A small one. So you have this churn statistics, or basically like where you measure if someone drops
Yes.
out.
Yep.
What's the time that you take until you kind of know that someone dropped out? Because if there's no activity in your open source for 6 months, maybe this person is on a paternity leave or something like
okay.
that.
Yep.
How do you measure if someone actually dropped out because you don't know?
Yeah, so this is a dropout actually of the organization. So it's when they're physically deleted from our HR system.
Oh, okay.
So it's a loss of
a
loss of an open source engaged engineer, which for us is more drastic than still having an open source engineer who perhaps doing a client project.
The reason why I asked is like I mentioned open source project.
Yep.
So also understanding if a contributor is gone
Yep.
is a very difficult question.
Absolutely, yeah. So we might use something like the project health to see a dip in contribution, which we could then go and investigate further. But that attrition one is actually, have they decided to go elsewhere? And then if we're really sleuth, we could go onto the GitHub profile and find where they've gone, and then maybe map that. But we don't do that, obviously. But
Different department.
of course, yeah. Sure, go ahead.
Your presentation.
Thank you.
If you had to pick one metric you get through your journey, or it give you that insight, is there one that comes up?
Good question.
Maybe about individuals.
Yeah.
Like it's interesting to see like individuals' engagement, especially the languages, and we also track licenses of what they contribute to. And the attrition one actually.
Yeah, I mean the
It's
attrition
really
one is
useful.
definitely my favourite. It's the one I get grilled on all the time. But my favourite metric in terms of when you get that email from the CTO or something to say, or pre-sales are always, what is our open source footprint like? To be able to say, oh, we had 550,000 commits in the public domain over the last 5 years, or we've got 247,000 repositories that we've contributed into. They're the kind of metrics that really tell the story. That's what the Gartners and the kind of IDC want to hear from a kind of solutions integrator perspective. But yeah, the attrition and retention one's my favourite one. Declan, go ahead.
Great presentation.
Thank you.
For how to make use of the data.
Absolutely.
I was just wondering, though, on your assessment frameworks on the graphs panel activity, is that an open source framework you're using, or is that something you've developed internally to measure?
Good question.
Great question. So, long story short, that's a proprietary solution called OS Pulse, which EPAM sells. But actually, at the crux of it, it's the GitHub API. It was a Power BI dashboard in Google Data Studio, and then we actually decided to build our own version just to give it a bit more of a nice, clean finish. But it's very, very simple to build your own off the back of it.
Maybe on top of that question, what about other source control systems like GitLab?
Yep.
So do you integrate with all of them?
Yeah, so at the moment it only integrates with GitHub, but the pipeline is GitLab, SourceForge, all of the kind of also the stuff that happens in the.
Because even, for example, you have the Drupal ecosystem.
Yes.
Their own,
Yeah.
repository,
Drupal's a perfect example.
That is a
Yeah.
really big contributor
So
to it as
Drupal's a
well.
perfect example. So about 2 years ago, the Drupal team actually started to just download their own data and manually push it into our solution so we could track it. And of course, we then off the back of it learned that we should probably be trying to integrate into other systems. But at the moment, it just works off GitHub. But the intention is really that it should be collecting everything.
And maybe then in addition, so I know on Drupal they also do attributions to the customer where you're working for.
Yes.
So you have the individual, then there's EPAM as the employer, and then there's the customer they might work for.
Yep.
Do you also intend to maybe feed that back into your base system?
We do. So we have we have a projects feature which we haven't shown here, which is the ability to group repositories into a specific client or a project. So, for example, we can differentiate and say, okay, of those 550,000 commits, 25% were to this client, who just so happens to be our biggest kind of engineering as a service. Yeah, exactly. So we can split them down further. And actually, a less client-specific but more interesting angle is we have a lot of users who just are interested in seeing, is this project going to do big things? So let's put a flag on it, group it together with a few others, and just start to see what that cadence looks like, that activity. And the Rust language is great because 3 years ago we saw probably 5 or 6 push events a month to Rust projects. Now it's just in the thousands, and we know, okay, as a company we should probably getting a bit more stuck into building some capabilities, maybe some pre-sales materials around. So I think we've got time for one more question. No? If not, then thanks. Please do engage with us online. I'll just jump back. And also, Kateryna's going to hate me for this, but this is Kateryna's first ever professional conference presentation. So well done. Have a great day. I'm also going to be on the Open UK stand. I'm their Chief Learning Officer. That's a non-profit, so I'll be downstairs on that stand for the rest of the day if anyone wants to have a chat about this or anything else. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.